you made it. They changed the settings on my end, so I had to go and look through the invite, and I'm like, what the heck? Who put these on there? And I'm like, the whole formatting of the Zoom on my end is different.
Oh, I was able to get in with the link that the admin person sent to like last week.
Oh, that would be me.
Okay, but it wasn't able. It went into my junk folder, so I didn't see it.
Oh, okay.
I couldn't get in with the link that you sent me today. Oh, well, I'm here.
Okay. How are you? I believe you're somewhere hot.
I'm in Hawaii. Yeah.
You mean you don't have 2.5 feet of snow and
yeah,
pretty temperatures?
I know. Yeah, I know my niece, the buses weren't running today because there was a snow day and it's so cold at home, but
I think people are jealous.
I'm here for a few months and then I'll be back again in the fall. So I'm doing good work here, but also trying to get some of my research and writing done and swimming a lot.
Are you paddling a lot as well?
I haven't yet. I just got here, so but I hope to. But
yeah, I have to put in administrative leave for my research leave. I'm trying to figure out if it's going to be July to January or January to July.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I have to put that in soon. Oh snap.
So the other panelists coming, or
I'm gonna keep my email open because I don't have admin support. I'm it. Small program. I don't see them contacting me. Oh, fuck. That's okay.
I'll forward you back that link that worked.
Okay.
Just in case they can't get in.
Yeah, I'm also keeping a look at the attendees list to make sure they didn't go that route. Because I think last month in December, that's what happened with some of the speakers. They went into the attendees.
Yeah, some of the universities, if you don't have an email from that university, like University of Manitoba, they won't let you in. So you have to go back and change your settings. I've had that a couple times.
Let me check. I thought I did that, but let me check again. Settings. Because I thought I selected them to be anyone with it shows anyone who can. Okay.
Made it. Sorry. I hope I didn't worry anybody.
The Zoom on my end changed, and I checked all the settings, and I just went back. And so I sent you what Alex sent me. So that seemed to have worked. And I think everybody else is figuring it out too.
Yay. Good to see everybody.
Hey, sorry, well, I don't know if I'm technically late, but I was trying to sign on and it kept sending me to the Laurier sign in and then as an attendee, and But we're here. We've got it.
Okay. Okay, I have to ensure that folks who are deaf or hard of hearing can have access, me being one of them, can have access. I turn the live transcription on, folks. That's on for you, for those in attendance. White. Oh yeah, people are starting to come on in. Better than 14, which was before.
Looks like the names might be wrong on the attendee.
Yeah, let me change. I think I can rename myself. No, I cannot.
Yeah, let's just do this.
Oh, there we go.
Let me just share the power. Share the power. Something happens to me, y'all got it covered. It's just one of those days. I've had something happen every single time I've been on Zoom for lecturing, meeting, something. So I'm just gonna take away the institutional settings, default settings of only Percy, Laurier can do it, to allow all of us distribute the put in waiting room or not settings, or rename ourselves settings. So I want to welcome folks. Want to be mindful of time. Everybody's responsible for a lot of things, and I want to respect your time, those in attendance. Welcome to the winter and the Enchichan Mohegan full moon for the winter. And this is our first circle council fire for the winter season. I saw a gap of Two-Spirit, Indigiqueer, 2SLGBTQQIA folks. And I figured, why not do it pre-tenure? Why not do it my first time as the chair? Why not? And so these relatives and kin were able to respond to the ask and said yes after my many cold emails out of the blue saying, hey, you interested in this? I'd really love to be in circle with you. So that's what brings us here today. Big miigwetches. I have to learn how to say it in other languages other than Anishinaabe-Moan. Kukuks to my language, NASL, to Wilfrid Laurier, Faculty of Liberal Arts, for creating space for us and by us. Now that's done. Just to be ethical and responsible for folks who may be in a space with other folks who have shared lived identities and potentially shared lived experiences. Here's some supports for you. If and when something does come up, even though it's joy, even though it's our story, sometimes it can move stuff. And I want to be able to provide folks with these things. So we have and also it's me being a jerk. I'm assuming you have a phone. I'm assuming that you have the bars wherever you're at geographically to be able to connect with these folks. So that's an assumption, my bad on my part. I'll do better next time for the next one. Okay. Just for folks who like to have an agenda or have protocol, I want to center indigeneity, and I'll change that for the next one too. Protocol, just want to provide an opportunity for our relatives and kin to introduce themselves. I'll do a brief introduction, and then there's some questions to engage conversation amongst us, for us, and by us. Related to 2SLGBTQQIA and identity. And that's very broad. It could be indigeneity, it could be orientation, it could be gender, it could be whatever it needs to be. And then closing remarks. I'll take a breath now. And then I'll try to, yes, okay. And and I like to popcorn style. I know people like to go to the left or to the right. We're Two-Spirit, Indigiqueer, gender diverse. I will just put it out popcorn style. Whoever feels inclined to share who they are, who their people are, some of their roles and responsibilities, and why it's important for us to know the ways and why we introduce ourselves this way. So I'll put myself on mute and welcome my relatives into the circle.
I can go first. I was trying to see if someone was reaching to go, but so Anin, hello, Shanese Indishnakas, and Dobodago Nishnabamnang, Jajakan Dodem, Nishnabe Meiti Makade Kwe, Toronto Ramiwa, Nabising Danjaba. Oops, I'll call right in the middle of doing this. I'm so sorry. Give me just a sec. There we go. Toronto Danjaba, Minwa, Nabising Danjaba, Benjamin Nakuya, Potawatomi. Can folks hear me? Yes, okay. And Mrs. Sagek. So hello, my name is Shanese Steele. I am Afro-Indigenous. So my father hails from the Caribbean. My mother hails from Nabising First Nation as well as Métis. And I am currently on the traditional territory of the Mississauga people, but I also reside part-time on the traditional territory of the Potawatomi people in Decatur, Illinois. So I'm kind of back and forth across that colonial border. My partner is in those territories, and so I'm there often. I'm Crane Clan. I think the most important part about me is that I'm a Virgo. I always tell people that. So just so you know who I am, you can kind of figure me out. I am someone who's in community with a lot of people from various different backgrounds. I am queer. And saying that I'm queer is something that took a long time to say, not because I necessarily was in the closet, but because I was trying to find a term that fit for me. And we'll get into that later, but I think so many of us are searching for terms, and it can take you a while to finally know how to refer to yourself. I am an activist, a writer. I spend a lot of my time trying to bridge the gap between Black people or people of African descent and Indigenous people to these lands. And so what does it mean to be in relationship to each other in a very colonial society? What does it mean to be displaced peoples that are forced to find ways to be in relationships with each other? That can sometimes be hard and difficult, and there's so much history there, right? And so how do we talk about that? How do we build a better future with each other? So that's the work that I do. I'm super excited to be here to have this conversation with everybody. I feel like oftentimes there's not a lot of space for us to talk about this. When we talk about being queer or two-spirited, oftentimes the conversation is centered around white folks, and specifically white cis men, which I've had enough of those conversations. And so I'm just excited to talk about what it means to be indigiqueer. What does it mean to thrive and live versus survive as a queer person, which is something that I think I wish our conversations would move away from. I don't want to talk about surviving anymore. How do we thrive? How do we live as indigiqueer folks, right? Let's talk about the future. So yeah, just super excited to be a part of this conversation, and I'll pass it off to the next panelist.
I can go ahead. Sio ganali ajo jalagi idle aoi jalagi gudi Danial Justice Dangodo Nagu Jigi Hulhwe Half Moon Bay BC Shishal Swea. My name is Danial Justice. Through my father, I'm a citizen of the Cherokee Nation. My family lines are primarily Spears and Foreman, but also of Riley and Shields descent. Through my mom, I'm of mixed settler heritage, primarily English and Jewish. And I was born and raised in Colorado, but now live here in what is called in English Half Moon Bay in Shishal territory. And I teach at UBC, and I'm actually teaching a Two-Spirit and Queer Indigenous Studies course right now, which is, well, not literally right now, but this term. And these questions I'm really excited about, and I'm very pleased to be here with these brilliant speakers, and I'm looking forward to learning a lot from this experience. So wado.
That's it. Hi, everyone. I think people are using the link that was for my name. So like we've got 10 Alex Wilsons attending now. So the trickster's doing their work, I guess. Wasanas and Tisnigasun, Pamaskatapan, Opasquayak, Ochinina. So my family or my name is Wasanas, which means shining light from within, which is a metaphor for teaching, I suppose. And then the place that I'm from is Pamaskatapan, which is a stream that runs into the Saskatchewan River, but that translates to a place where you have to kind of get out of the canoe and pull it, or it also means like a place off to the side. So that fits the queer kind of theme very well. And then community I'm from is the Opaskwayak Cree Nation, which is on the Saskatchewan River system and connects to Cedar Lake, which connects to Lake Winnipeg, and all of that flows north to the Hudson Bay. And then there's many, like thousands of lakes and small rivers in our territory. So I'm really happy to be here, Percy. Thanks for organizing this, and great to see the other panelists. Some who are, I'm just meeting Shanese, I'm just meeting you, and Daniel, I've known of your work, of course, for many years, and we've communicated before. So in terms of what I do, I am a teacher and I work at the University of Saskatchewan. And then I also work in my community and other communities, usually around land protection in some way. And one of the current projects I'm working on is figuring out sustainable housing for Indigenous peoples. And that's part of the reason why I'm here now, hosted by Kanaka Maoli in Hawaii. So during my sabbatical, I'm here. So if you hear sounds in the background, that's the waves. So I'm really happy to be here and glad I was invited here, and looking forward to continuing this conversation.
Waikas Kalhau and Chakan, Percy and Chichin Lazard. I want to give thanks to Kaylin Chutin, creator, for allowing me to be here as a continued guest on the Dish with One Spoon to Toronto. I split my time here as a guest and in my own homeland, Simpington, which loosely translate to depends which family you talk to, and dialect, right? A place to live forever or village between lakes. But either way, I'm surrounded by lakes and mountains, and that of my people. My people are there are many different ways my people identify themselves. Seal, Sukunau Kaint, and Skalo. My family identifies ourselves as Skalo, people of the land. And my family are the Krugers from Arrow Lakes, the Baptistes from Chipaka, the Pierres just over Upper Nicola, and the Lizards from Penticton. And my territory extends to Colville Confederated Tribes, which is part of Washington State. Through matrilineal, the Manuel Georges on my my life giver's side of the family. What do I do? What do I get paid to do, and what do I love to do? Well, I get paid to be, I believe, a check in a box. My intersecting identities as Indigenous, as Two-Spirit, as trans, as disabled, meets a lot of equity, diversity, inclusion markers for the institution. And I have a home right now, Wilfrid Laurier Brantford campus in the Indigenous Studies program. They decided to offer me the chair position, so I figured I would do that for tenure. I didn't have relatives to say don't do that, or in terms of non-interference to say here are some ways in which you could spend your time. A lot of my time is spent in community, with community, getting direction from community, young folks. My internal governance system is that young people are elders, and that may not be the case for my other relatives and kin, which is amazing. I raise my hands up to you, to your governance systems. But I spend a lot of time getting direction and reminded of my roles and responsibilities while I'm in these spaces, in these institutions, to push back. Some of my roles, I'm a hereditary chief through both my life giver and my life provider. I'm also a firekeeper and a helper. hence me being a social worker registered to find out that a system that's not meant to work or help us at all. It actually causes us harm. So yeah, that's a little bit about me. And I am so grateful that you folks answered the call and the hoop and holler and the drum beat to come and share niblets with those in attendance. Going to provide a visual because visual helps folks. So I'm going to leave this up and I'm going to ask Alex to see what if you can respond to what does identity mean for you in our current context, and then I'll ask the other panelists to share with us. And I'll put myself on mute. Lim Lim.
Yeah, thank you. I've been thinking about this question since you posed it. Of course, it's a big one. And I was talking to my dad about this too and asked him, like, do we even have a word for identity in Cree? You know, because it just seems like in many ways it wouldn't be a concept that that we would have, because you would just kind of know who you were. So we had a good discussion about that, and the thing that we came up with was, yeah, there's a term, but it means when someone talks about you or when you introduce yourself, it's like what you're known for, and so there's an action involved in that. So identity in a Cree context anyway has to do with what you're known for, the actions that you're known for. And then also, of course, all of that links to land. And the programs that I work with are most of the work that I do is Indigenous land-based education in many different contexts. And that seems to be kind of a universal with Indigenous communities, that kind of link to land. And then land meaning, you know, everything that's connected to land as well. So animals, plants, air, and then even sometimes the theory that goes with it. So that's kind of the way that I was thinking about identity. And when I started my PhD work or my doctoral work in the 1990s, last century, I was looking at two-spirit identity because, you know, it's right around the time when we first started using that term, two-spirit, when the term was gifted to the community and people went through ceremony to accept and take on that term. And then I thought, well, what does it mean? What does two-spirit identity mean? And I started, you know, looking at what others write about identity, and there's a lot of identity development theory. The one thing that was kind of common with all the theories back then and continues today is that they're looking at discrete threads of identity, so that it's a kind of a compartmentalization. So they'll look at or sexual orientation. So, you know, there's the coming out theories, or they'll look at ethnic identity or their gender identity. And so the uniqueness or maybe the life-giving part of two-spirit identity was that it was an interconnection of all parts, and then even beyond that to connect to land and spirituality. So that's what I think of the current context of identity, is of all of those things and then how they connect, and then those connections, the responsibilities that come with them. And then I think as well, something that's important in the Cree context anyways, is like words are mostly verb based rather than nouns, like rather than a role, it's like what you do, like, you know, the action part. And so there's like this implicit understanding that identity, it can be fluid and non-binary. So it's built right into the cosmology. And I think that's apropos for our conversation today, because, you know, we're shifting to the winter, and in many nations in Cree, Swampy Cree, we don't like, it's not like you can't tell a story in the summer. Obviously we tell stories all the time, but you know, it's the time where we had more time to sit inside and and the sky is dark most of the time in northern Manitoba. So those are the times when these stories came out, and a lot of them connect to cosmology and really have to do with understanding our place within our families, within our communities, and families can be created families, our communities, our created communities, our genealogy, and then within the wider universe. So I find those stories really beautiful, and I love the queering part of them, or the queering aspect. So I'm always happy to hear when others can uncover or bring those stories back to, bring life back to them and share. I go see. Thank you.
Shanice, I was wondering if you could enlighten us.
Yeah. It's funny, Percy, when you were talking about filling the box, like when I think of my identity, oftentimes people book me for things because I fit that box. Like I'm Black and Indigenous and queer and fat and women presenting. And so it's like, I check all those boxes, right? I'm the right thing. I'm kind of like Swiss Army knife, I think, of the equity. That's what I like to think of myself, Swiss Army knife. But yeah, I think identity is something that I think I'm seeing folks struggle with more now, because you have all of these boxes, all of these places that you can be fit into, right? Like I love the idea that, or the fact that we do have terms that we can identify with, but sometimes I feel like we're trying to force ourselves into boxes so that we can fit somewhere, right? I know when I was growing up and I was trying to figure out my queerness, my identity around my sexuality, at first I was like, well, I'm bisexual, and then I was a lesbian, and then I was pansexual, and then I was a lesbian again, and it was trying to fit myself into these boxes because I knew I wasn't aligning with what society saw as the norm, but I also felt that I wasn't aligning with a lot of the other terms and boxes that were out there for me to fit myself in. And so I think what I've noticed, especially with youth, and I've done a lot of work with youth around gender and sexuality, is I'll walk into, or when I was walking into classrooms before the pandemic, I'd walk into a classroom and kids would be like, yeah, I'm pansexual, gender non-conforming. Like they had a whole list and they were 12. And I was like, that's great, but also that's going to change. Like how you identify and how you move through the world is going to change. And I think sometimes identity feels like this stagnant thing. Like you have to identify as something and you can't move out of it, because if you do, then people are going to question you, right? Like if you're someone who's bisexual and you go from dating someone of the same sex or the same gender or however you identify, and then you date someone of the opposite sex, well, you're no longer queer, right? We remove people out of identities the second that they don't necessarily fit into these really small constraints that we assign to terms or definitions and things like that. And so I think identity for me is sometimes something that I struggle with, because some days I wake up and I'm like, I just want to be Shanese. Like, I don't want to be someone who has to identify with everything. And not because I don't love my culture and I don't love where I come from and I don't love who I am. But I think oftentimes that there's people that just wake up. They wake up and they go about their day and they don't log into their phone and they don't have to see the pain that a lot of our communities have to deal with, and they just go about their days and their lives and they're happy. And I'm like, what would that be like as like an Indigenous queer, as an Afro-Indigenous person, to just wake up in the morning and go about my day, that I don't have to think about all of these identity boxes that the world's about to put me in, right? And I think that happens a lot with folks who are gender non-conforming or who are exploring their gender, right? It's waking up and I can't just put on my clothes and go about my day. I have to think about, well, how is someone going to react to what I'm wearing and what I'm doing and how I'm talking, right? And so I don't know, but then at the same time, I'm like, okay, I'm a strong, sometimes weak, because it's okay to be weak, but I'm a strong, weak, Afro-Indigenous fat person, and queer, and that's great. Like I love those parts of me, and those are the parts of me that I want to celebrate. And so I don't know, when it comes to identity, I wish we could move to a place where our identities don't sometimes feel like they're shackling us down, right? But that we can also celebrate them in ways that don't feel like we're doing it for other people's attention, or we're doing it to be reaffirmed by other people, right? Because I think for a lot of us, we want to be affirmed in ourselves without having to search outwards. It's great to have other people be like, yeah, you're really dope in who you are. But I just want to wake up and know that, right? I want to know that in that identity. So yeah, I think for me, in the current society that we're in, right? Everyone's talking about critical race theory and all of these things, and you know, they're getting all worried about it. But like, I just want to be. That's my identity. I want my identity to just be, and I want people to respect that without questioning it and without pushing me to fit myself into boxes that I don't actually want to be in. I hope that made sense. Sometimes I feel like I'm ranting all over the place, but yeah, I love my identity, but sometimes I just want to be Shanese. And I wonder a lot of days what that means to just be me.
Daniel, I'm wondering if you could share with us how you've made sense of identity in this current
Yeah.
time.
Yeah, and thank you. And also thank you to Alex and Shanice. I think my feelings echo some of the same kinds of ideas. And I think it's been more acute for me lately because in November, I lost my mom. And, just a couple of years ago, I lost my dad. And so I've been thinking a lot about who I am when those relationships are now, they're ancestors now, right? And I had a better sense of who I was when I could call them up, right? And get advice or share stories or clarify things, right? And I can't do that anymore. And in a lot of ways, I'm the person who holds a lot of family stories, and I'm the youngest of my dad's kids. We lost my sister a couple of years ago too. So I've been thinking, when Alex was talking about language and the verbs, and identity as a verb, and I think that also speaks to Shanice's, discussing, how so often people try to put us in a box, very noun, but we verb out of it all the time. So I've been thinking about identity really as, those relationships and the working of those relationships. And, I was, in a lot of ways, my identity with my parents at the end of their lives was to help them cross over. And, performing a really important role. My mom was there when my heart started, and I was there when hers stopped. And then thinking kind of more broadly, as a queer person, in my nation, what we also participate in, especially as a teacher, we participate in helping the young grow, and learning from the young as well. But I'm thinking very much about identity in the roles. I mean, my identity is who I'm related to and what I do in those relationships. And when those relationships change, our identities change. And so in a lot of ways, I'm still trying to figure that out, and trying to reorient myself. Now I'm the person now who my nephews will come to for family story. They can't go to my dad for that. And my brothers come to me, which is weird because they're significantly older. So I think identity, obviously it means so many different things, but very, very personally, I think for me, it's thinking about how to reorient myself in a world where I don't have the same anchors that I did. And now understanding that I'm, in a more immediate way, I'm going to have to be more of an anchor for others. Because I could kind of rely on them, right? And I can't. I mean, now it's my job. So it's still very fresh in that way. But when I was reading your question, that is what came to mind, was thinking about the roles we play and the work that we do, and how that inevitably changes over time. What do?
Yeah, I was just, as people are sharing and Kukukstan, my had relative, condolences to you. And I just want to do condolence to those in attendance who have lost a loved one in the past 4 seasons who became ancestors. I think in the current context, the fact that we're all in English, speaking in English and not any one of our Indigenous language, and that, yes, this is the time, much like Alex had shared, yeah, this is a time where we would be in our winter homes, our pit houses, learning who we are as a Esquisti Skeloch through stories and song, and preparing the one of the 4 food chiefs that we spent gathering before the snow came, about who we are intergenerationally. And it wasn't based on gender or sexual orientation. It's just like, okay, Alex had the capacity to know how to harvest our 4-legged relatives. Shanice knew how to harvest the ones that grew under the ground. And Daniel was the one who knew how to help those folks who were transitioning from a young person into a life giver, a life provider, or in the other cycle, and to becoming a grandparent. Or kukum, right? So yeah, so the context, we're in English, and it's a time of year to do these things. And I think in terms of identity, I'm much like folks here, much like yourself. I lost 2 siblings, an older sibling and a younger sibling in the past 2 seasons. And my governance system is based on age order. And I don't know what to do. That an older sibling has passed, that when things happen, I look to them and ask their support. And when I go to my homelands and I want to or need to do some things that's asked of me by the people, the family, those in need, I would go look for my younger sibling, and we go like this in a truck or cruising around the res, doing what we needed to do for fires as firekeepers, or to gather medicines for our people who need it. So I feel lost. I feel lost. I feel grief, and I feel this 5th or 20th or 60th wave that we're in for COVID. The real isolation, because I would want to be next to my relatives and kin. And not only am I geographically so far away from my bio family, but my extended family are immunocompromised like myself. So we're literally in our bubbles. So I'm gonna sit next to you folks, right, as my relatives through this time. I'm wondering if, Shanice, if you could share with us your musings around some of the complications or tensions that you experience within the context of identity. I know you kind of alluded to it.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting, as everyone was talking, right? We're talking about verbs, the language, right, is verbs versus nouns. And I think about the word kwe, right, in Anishinaabe, which most people would translate to woman, right? When we're translating it to English. And I always say English is such a lazy language. Like, it's because it's not descriptive. It's not a descriptive language, right? Like when you say woman, you're like, okay, woman, but kwe doesn't actually translate to woman, right? Like if you were to actually translate the word, it translates to person who's constantly in transition. And so I've had like a hard time growing up trying to figure out where I fit in the word of woman, right? Like in the context of colonial Canadian understanding, but also sometimes within the context of my Caribbean family. Like, what does it mean to be a Black woman? And there was all of these things that came with it that I was like, I don't, that doesn't fit for me. That doesn't work for me. And as I was learning the language and I was being taught words and they were being translated to English, right? And we're using those very simple words. It was hard for me to connect with my language. And I think that happens for a lot of folks when we're trying to learn our language or our traditional ceremonies. Oftentimes, unfortunately, colonialism has changed the meaning of them, right? Or has gendered things that weren't gendered before. And so there was a lot of conflict or tension within myself in trying to connect to my language, because I was like, this is supposed to help me figure out my identity, right? This is supposed to help me connect more to who I am as a Métis Anishinaabe Kwe. Like, what does that mean? And I was still getting a lot of the same definitions and understandings that I was getting in a colonial Western English context. And then it wasn't until an elder sat down with me and broke down that word. And I was like, person who's constantly in transition, that makes a lot of sense for me as how I shift through the world. I'm a person who's constantly transition. And, you know, technically they're referring to your body, right? Like the transition of your body. But I took that to mean not just that, but how I moved through the world and how I moved through life. And I remember I was trying to, I don't know, sexify the language. Like I was trying to translate sex terms into Anishinaabe. And I remember I was asking a friend, like, how do I say like bad girl? Like, I want to know how to say that in Anishinaabe. And he was like, oh, well, it's Majikwe, but the word magic doesn't actually mean bad. It means person who's going down the wrong path. And I was like, oh, great. I'm a person who's going down the wrong path, who's constantly in transition. Okay, that makes sense, right? Like, it's not as sexy as I thought it was going to be, but it makes sense because that's who I am, right? Sometimes I go down that wrong path and I am in transition. So, but yeah, it was allowed me as I started to unpack those words and the stories behind those words, right? Because we understand for a lot of Indigenous languages, and specifically for Anishinaabe, there's stories behind the words. Like you'll hear some elders even say there's stories behind the sounds. A word's not simply just a word, a sound's not simply just a sound. And so having the stories and the teachings being broken down behind that alleviated some of the tension and the conflict that I was having with my own community. And as I started to learn more about my Black side and my Caribbean side and what it meant to navigate in that space, it was less about being, you know, the colonial understanding of a woman, but again, back to like, what's that role in family? What is my role? Right. And I think going back to understanding that, and you were talking about that, Daniel, about like the role. What is your role? That's your identity. That's how you identify as your role in your relationship and how you connect to people. And learning that really alleviated that conflict. It alleviated that tension, right? And so I think when people are able to learn those stories and those teachings and those real meanings behind some of these terms that we're using for identity, then you're able to connect more. You're able to understand who you are more, right? Because when you're simply getting those simple definitions, right, that is based in colonialism, it's hard to connect sometimes. Most times it's hard to connect. And so I think, yeah, that's where the tension was for me. And then definitely being Afro-Indigenous, there was tension in that, identifying, you know, as someone who moves through the world as a Black person and what it means to also be Indigenous and how do I navigate those spaces and unpacking anti-Blackness here and anti-Indigeneity here and what does that all mean, right? Like those are some of the things that I had to deal with. But I think what helped that was finding elders and community members and youth who told me it was okay to be me. Right. And that's what I was saying earlier with society telling you it's not okay to be you, right? You can't just wake up and be you in the morning. Sometimes it helps to have those community members that can say, here's the teaching that validates who you are. Here's the story that's been with our nations or our communities for thousands of years, right? Because we understand our teachings are thousands of years old. Right. And unfortunately, because of colonialism, sometimes they get shifted, the meanings get shifted, but those stories are still there. And so it's just finding them. And then when it comes to my queer identity, you know, I had a hard time around identifying as Two-Spirit. And the reason why I had a hard time around that is because in ceremony, being Two-Spirit means you have a very specific role in ceremony, right? As an Anishinaabe person, being Two-Spirit, is all about your role in community. So you're a fire keeper and you raise children who don't have families to raise them and you pass on teachings and there's all of these things that come with it. And as I was growing up, I didn't feel like I could fit that role in community, that I wasn't ready for those responsibilities in community. And sometimes I'm still unsure about that. And that's that conflict, right? Of trying to figure out, okay, here's a term that fits as an Indigenous person. Yes, I'm Two-Spirit, but when it fits into my role into community, it might be different. It might shift. And so that's why I started identifying as queer. But I think there's always going to be complications in tension and conflict within identity, because we are people who are constantly in transition. We are people constantly changing. Who I identify as today might not be who I identify as tomorrow, right? And so it's being okay with that, figuring out what that means and being okay with it, and understanding that, you know, my identity is going to change. And I think the best example I had of that was my brother. He's 14 years old, but at 10 years old, he came out as bisexual. And he was like, this is who I am. This is me. I'm it. And we had a really great talk about it. And then it was like last year we were having a conversation. I was like, so you crushing on anybody at school? Like, what's going on? You know, being the bigger sibling and trying to find that out. And I asked him, any boys, any girls, anybody? And he was like, oh, I realized that I'm not bisexual. I think I'm straight. And I was like, look at you in the span of, you know, 3 years in your pre-teens, you went through your sexual awakening and figured out who you were, and that might also change. It might change as he gets older. It might shift back. It might change to something else. But I think the way he was so okay with it, like, I thought I was, I went through it and now I'm not. And I think that's such a beautiful thing, and that he was able to have that space. So a way to alleviate a lot of that tension is creating the space. And my family was able to do that for him. And so I think now, when I'm talking to other people, how do I create space for their identity to flow and change, right? Because I can't be rigid. If their identity is not rigid, I can't be rigid with their identity, right? And so just opening up that space. I always think of my brother, you know, how would my brother navigate this? And shoot, for 14 years old, he's a pretty smart kid and got it down. So I'm gonna take his lead. That's that taking the lead from the youth, right? So yeah.
Daniel, I wonder if you could share with us your understandings.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's such a big question. I mean, I really liked Shanice's discussion about, you know, the youth changing, and I think part of the tension for me is I find my sometimes that openness, I don't quite know what to do with it, right? And so, I mean, I think I'm learning a lot from the fluidity of younger people, because I think for me, coming out and coming of age, it really was about holding on really tight to certain identity markers and categories. Even if they didn't quite fit, they still gave some sense of certainty in a world that was very confusing. And so I sometimes look at the young folks and I'm like, wow, you really don't have the same kinds of anxieties in certain ways. You have different anxieties. And I think it's a really beautiful thing, but I think it's also really easy to kind of be like, well, back in my day, and yet still try to, you know, where is that intergenerational kind of knowledge transmission? I mean, you know, those of us who are older, who came of age in a different time, I mean, there's a history there, right? And you know, and that history had a huge rupture as, you know, a result of another pandemic, and we lost a lot of elders of multiple genders as a result of that. And so, you know, I'm kind of young, but I'm still an elder in some ways. I'm not taking on the role, but like I'm older anyway, and have some sort of generational knowledge. And so I'm, you know, what is my role in terms of sharing and nurturing and encouraging, but also learning? And so I think that's a complication, maybe more than a tension, but I do think the conversations are just, in a lot of ways, they're very different. Some of the conversations are the same, but there are a lot of new ones. And, you know, the multiplicity of terms and the multiplicity of identities, and that's a beautiful thing. I'm so glad that for so many young people, not all, but for so many, that there is more safety than there was when I was coming of age. Again, that's not for everybody, obviously, but for a lot, there is more space where they can explore that, and more places where they can see that reflected in the world. I do think, you know, and going back a little bit to Alex's discussion about the land, you know, when I think about Cherokee identity, you know, we have almost 400,000 citizens. It might even be more than that. And you know, connections to community are thin for a lot of folks, and connections to land and that history of that place is very thin. You know, my family's part of that diaspora. You know, and there's, you know, everybody in the States apparently is Cherokee, right? So those kinds of arguments as well in those discussions. But I think that's another identity tension. You know, how do you uphold kinship when there are so many of us scattered over such a geographic region, some with very, very, very thin links at all? How do we behave as kin and not national subjects? You know, I identified myself as a citizen, which is important in our context because of a lot of people who claim Cherokee heritage without evidence of it. But citizenship itself is also a very complex and difficult thing. And then you map other kinds of identities on top of that. So I do worry that so often identity gets disconnected from land, and it gets disconnected from kinship, and it becomes a matter just of descent, or a matter just of a story, but we don't have those other things that undergird that. And that is dangerous. I think it's dangerous for our nations. I think it's dangerous for our families, but I think it's also dangerous for the future. And I don't have an answer to that, but I think these are some of the questions and some of the issues that we have to talk more about. If we don't have those ties to kin and territory, even, you know, I wasn't raised in Oklahoma, Northeast Oklahoma, and, you know, our homelands are originally out east, in the Southeast. What does that do to our indigeneity when we're getting more and more and more distanced from the lands to which we're indigenous?
Holy Alex.
Yeah. And then that, just to kind of continue with that too, is like this whole issue of identity fraud. And I mean, that's a big one right now. It's a tension, a complication. And, you know, working at the University of Saskatchewan, everyone probably has heard about the case there, but there are many. And then also, if you extend that to queer identity, you know, what is queer identity fraud? Because there are people that will benefit in some way by taking space from others. And, you know, that's a conversation that's a difficult one, because if we talk about identity as being fluid, sexuality as being fluid, and, you know, other gender being fluid or non-binary, is it something that you can just decide and change, right? Or are there spiritual aspects that are, I don't want to say essential, but that are ignited or nourished by our connection to land? So that links to ceremony, and why ceremony is so important, and why we've done it forever, since the beginning of time, you know, when we were cells, I guess, out there floating around in the universe, energy. But that's the thing, that's the continuity. The continuity is energy. And so in that sense, there's no roles. And I try not to use the word role, because whenever you use the word role, there's somebody that's going to be acting. And what that has meant for Two-Spirit people and for Indigenous and particularly queer people is that acting has meant like sacrificing a part of who you truly are. And that is the direct implication, or the direct result of not just genocide, but epistemicide. So that's the severing of our knowledge systems, or the transmission of knowledge. So and that is also related to and linked with the severing of our land-based knowledge and our lands. And so it's all part of that colonial thing. And so the status quo is heteropatriarchy, and it's so easy for things to fall back into that. And it's just like a machine that goes on and on. It doesn't need any attention. And other scholars have used that analogy before, even Western scholars. You know, it's just like, it doesn't need any work. It needs no grease. It needs no cranking, nothing. It just goes on its own. And so I guess this kind of links to your next question too, Percy, is that how do we center Indigenous knowledge? Is that we have to be the ones that are continually throwing things into those cogs as we nourish our own machinery, I guess, our own processes. And, I see that happening in ceremony where, people are excluded. So we have to figure out ways or find the people that don't exclude. So that's a way of centering, to find the people that don't do that. Or, if something aligns with heteropatriarchy, it usually gets repeated and then retold as the way things are. If it doesn't align, it's easily lost. So I think that's another part of our role as all of us here in the work that we do, is to continually look for and listen for and, repeat, share, whatever, those stories that do, the ones that do get pushed to the side. And then I think it also will kind of deal with the issue of romanticization too of queer identity, which has been so prevalent, especially like in the first maybe in the 1940s all the way till now. But the initial anthropologists that came to study, queer gender and sexual variation and Native nations is the way they talked about it. But they were just looking for something that they didn't have in their own communities. And so that really also was internalized by people, and we've repeated that. And so sometimes when I hear people sharing roles, that maybe those weren't the roles. There's millions of roles, like thousands of roles. So we have to kind of work on figuring that out too. And then the other thing, I guess, just to conclude, is that I really love it when we can talk like this. And then I'm also looking through the attendees list to see which familiar names I see. And I see a few had friends out there. And I see people on there that are die-hard supporters and allies of queer, indigenous queer people. And I thank them and thank everybody for the work that you're all doing.
Segue, I'm wondering, Daniel, if you could engage the last question.
The centering. I dream of futures where we're not, and going back to Shanice's point, where we're not just present, but we're just flourishing. In all our fullness and in all of our complication and in all of our weirdness and wonderfulness, that's what I dream of, is that we have a future, and the future is really amazing, and that there's space for it. Nobody's disposable, that all of our gifts can really flourish and be brought to bear on everybody's well-being as well. I think for me, that's what I dream of, is a future where we have turned everything technicolor because we're able to be fully ourselves, and help other people do that as well, right? Because that issue of liberation is for everybody. Decolonization is to help all of our communities, not just the indigiqueer members of the communities. So that's my dream.
Shanice.
Yeah, I was just going to say, Daniel, your comment earlier about what does it mean to be so displaced from land. This is a perfect time for Black and Indigenous folks to have this conversation about what it means to be extremely displaced from land and that connection. So yeah, but to go off of what should the centering of indigeneity or two-spiritness or indigiqueerness look like? I think Daniel said it, like, it's just living, it's thriving, it is flourishing, as you said, it is being able to be ourselves without constantly thinking about what it means to be ourselves. I mean, we're humans, so we're always going to have like those crises of like, who am I and what am I doing? It's just gonna happen. But I think, yeah, being able to live and dream in ways that are healthy, in ways that allow us to be happy, in ways that allow us to connect to the land, right? I think about what that future looks like. It looks like us being able to connect to our traditional homelands, not simply just where our reserves or reservations are, but where we're from. What does it mean to step on that soil and connect to that land and do ceremony on that land as Indigenous people, but indigiqueer people, right? To like have those ceremonies back for us to connect and to know who we are and who we are to each other. I think for me, it looks like the returning, or not the returning, because we've always been here, not to quote every white gay man, we've always been here, but like we have always, as Indigenous queer folks, we have always been here. That is fact. But when I think about, you know, Indigenous queer communities globally, and what it would mean to be open and free and Indigenous and queer in India or in Kenya, right? Or in Mexico or in Belize, like what does it mean to be Indigenous and queer and safe and happy and thriving globally? I don't want to just think in the context of the city of Toronto or the province of Ontario or the country of Canada. Like, I don't want to think about these colonial borders and places that have been established. I want to know that I can be Indigenous and queer and free no matter where I go, right? And what does that mean of returning to those stories and those teachings around who we are as people, right? You go to places like India and you see that in Hinduism, genderqueer folks have been there the entire time, right? That's in their scripture. And yet in today's society, they're being erased because of the way in which colonialism has affected India. And I think about queer folks in the Caribbean. I'm from Trinidad. Carnival's our biggest celebration. And I think about the way in which a lot of folks bend gender and how they dress during Carnival, and what that means to explore your gender identity through Carnival, which is ceremony, right? For people of African descent, we are Indigenous people displaced from our homelands. And what does it mean in those identities to be queer and happy and thriving? So yeah, I think for me, the future, just we're thriving and we're ourselves and we are happy and we are moving through the globe. And maybe, you know what, maybe the universe, maybe we are moving through the universe at this point, but we are Indigenous and we are queer. Like, where's my indigiqueer people in Star Wars? You know, like where, like I want it. That's what I want. I want to envision the future of us just happy. So yeah, that's what it looks like for me. And that's what it should look like. It should look like not another Indigenous queer person feeling that they don't belong in this world. It should look like, you know, Indigenous and Black trans folks being able to live long lives. Like, I want to see a 103-year-old trans woman. That's what I want. I want to see it. I want to see it. I want her to be celebrating her 103rd birthday on the news, surrounded by people who love her. Like, those are the futures I want. I want to see us old. I want elders. I want elders that can live and thrive. And I don't want it to be a handful of people. I want all of us to reach that. Every single one of us. I mean, I might not want to be 103, but I want to get to the old age. I want all of us to get to the old age. So yeah, that's what the future looks like for me. That's what I dream of, and that's what I feel like it should be right now, but we'll get there.
Alex, I know you did a pseudo partial answer for both of them. I'm just wondering if there's anything you would like to further add.
I think I'll just end with kind of a quote from a friend of mine, Kalani Young, who's a native Hawaiian Kanaka Maoli. And she says that queering is transforming poison into medicine. And I love that because I see that happening. And I guess the future would be where we wouldn't have to do that anymore, but really, yeah, it's a beautiful, beautiful saying and a beautiful thought.
Yeah. Yeah, holy smokes. I'm going to be left with that for a while. I know one of the quotes that I constantly carry with me in my heart and my interactions with learners, with community, with the land is, am I engaging in this? Dr. Dillard would say, am I doing this to heal or to bleed? Right. So that's a very similar sentiment. Want to respect people's time. Responses. Responses. I think folks have shared more than enough responses for people to reflect upon. I look forward to the day that I can respond and not react. I look forward to the day, honestly, where I can be mediocre without being exceptional. I'm serious, without being exceptional, right? I look forward to being mediocre and being able to just live my life and not having to be exceptional. And if you're, for my relatives in the South Pacific and across the prairies, I see my prairie relatives and kin and out east and out west. If you have not heard this today, and if this has not been your experience this week in terms of COVID, lockdown, justifiable fear of many systems and states, the medical model system, the police state, all carceral, that if you have not heard, I see you, I love you, I value you, my relatives and kin. I love you and I value you. And I want to share again the resources as a responsible, or a supportive, affirming relative. I'm doing this. And I want to just to continue the conversation that has been alluded to today. Black History Month is happening. And I really want to tease and I really want to center Black and Indigenous kinship. And if you are more than available, folks, I invite you to come back. Erica, Josh, and Dr. Adil Abdullahi will be here. And with that, travel safe, be well, relatives and kin. Until next time, Kukuk Stanmi.
Bye, Ma.